All right, so let's get into what this like imaginary number I means. And in the last video, you should have seen that um, somebody really messed up calling him imaginary because I'm sure you're thinking there, sitting there thinking it doesn't mean anything because it's imaginary. Why we learn about this? And some of you might never use this again, and some of you might. So just like everything you learn in life, you may use it, you may not. All right. So what does I mean? So I, as the previous video talked about, um, comes up because people didn't know what to do with negatives when they were trying to solve stuff. So if we think of I we get comes when we have a negative of some number, and so we let I be the square root of -1. And so whenever you're taking the square root of a negative, you've got to think to pull out that square root of a -1, and that turns into an I, because they wanted to get rid of that negative. It's almost like a placeholder that tells us, hey, this is actually a negative we're taking a square root of. All right, so another key thing when we're talking about I is that somebody along the line said, hey, we get to a lot of points where we end up squaring I. So we get I squared. And if we break that down, that just tells us that I squared is the same as I times I, right? Just like 4 squared is 4 times 4. And if we take the fact that I is, that in there, I is the square root of -1 times the square root of -1. Change colors, I guess. Then we get that that's the same as saying -1 squared. And so all we did was plug in what was given. That I is equal to negative, or the square root of -1. And so we get to this point where we have that I squared is equal to square root of -1 squared. When we go through and do this, we can cancel out these, right? Because squared cancels out the square root. So we're left with -1. So we get that I squared is equal to -1. And so that's not as important for today's stuff, but we do get to that a lot tomorrow. And so very, very important that I is equal to the square root of -1, as well as I squared is equal to -1, right? So those are two key big takeaways from this. So let's kind of use this I is equal to the square root of -1 idea. So let's look down here. So we have in example 1, we want to either simplify or evaluate. So if we have the square root of -16, normally along the lines you'd say, all right, there's no solution, you can't do it, right? Can't take the square root of a negative. Well, now when we introduce these imaginary numbers, we can, right? So we're going to break down this first one. Wrong tool. We're going to break down this first one into square root of -1 times the square root of 16. And so you should know what the square root of 16 is, right? Square root of 16 gets you 4. And we've now talked about previously that I is the same as square root of -1. So we get 4 times I. And if we simplify that, we get 4I. So really not too difficult, right? All is just recognizing to know when to put I and when not to put I. All right, so let's try example. Let's jump over to example 3. All right, so example 3 just has the square root of 25. If we look at that, hopefully you look at yourself and you say, oh, okay, I know that, that's 5. Right, square root of 25 is 5. How come we didn't have to use I, right? There's no negative in the square root, so there's no reason to use that 5. If we break down here, right, there is a negative. There's a negative in that square root of -36. So that tells us we need to pull an I out. Pull an I out. Then we need to take the square root of 36. So what's the square root of 36? should get 6, and so we get 6i. All right, next one may need some calculator help. So if you go in and you say, all right, there's a negative, so I know I need to pull out an I, right? That negative right there tells us we need to pull out an I. And then we're left over with the square root of 89. We go through and try to figure out what the square root of 89 is in our calculator. Should get you something like 9.4, continues on, right? So it's not a nice perfect square, right? You're not going to get a nice square root out of it. So in that case, we take our I out, and we leave our 89 positive in there. Notice because we took our I out, we got rid of the negative.